Good evening, class. My name is Eva Painter, and I will be reviewing the article titled Functions of Support Group Communication for Women with Postpartum Depression, How Support Groups Silence and Encourage Voices of Motherhood by Lakeisha N. Anderson out of Indiana State University. This article was published in 2013 in the Journal of Community Psychology. The first thing I'm going to do is discuss how our text, the Handbook of Group Communication Theory and Research, defines a social support group. So Frey and Poole on page 516 describe social support groups as small groups formed for the specific purpose of providing mutual aid among members who share a common dilemma. And they distinguish a social support group from social support from our family and friends because this is a more formally organized phenomenon. And that communication lies at the heart of social support groups. So this article looks at how new mothers who are members of 3 different types of social support groups receive different types of social support. So the first thing the article does is talk about postpartum depression in general. It is the most common psychiatric illness for new mothers. 10 to 20% of postpartum mothers do experience postpartum depression. Symptoms include lack of energy, lack of appetite, extreme depression are just a few to mention. And then it can get extreme to even feelings of wanting to harm your baby. All of these symptoms can have serious implications for both mother and child. This illness is also highly stigmatized for 2 reasons. The author says that women are often uncomfortable sharing this information with their close family and friends and doctors as well because it is so stigmatized. You know, the media always reports these instances where women end up either killing themselves or their children. So it's a very dark disease as described by our media, which leads to its being highly stigmatized. The second reason is that it can be missed in a diagnosis. It can be confused for just the struggles of that every new mother experiences. So the article then goes over a literature review. The overarching theme of all the research referenced by the author is that communication in social support groups does influence how people actually experience an illness like postpartum depression. So one example would be the study by Hay, Coombs, and Bartlett in 2004 that found that Taiwanese postpartum women with higher levels of social support were less depressed. Scrandis 2005 found that social support groups help to normalize women's symptoms and feelings. All of these articles referenced by the author are corroborated by our text. Frey and Poole make a point to discuss how social support is linked to health. They reference that social relationships can be linked to susceptibility of disease, that it can buffer against pathology, it can accelerate recovery, or it can even enhance compliance and treatment. So the author conducted this study with a theoretical framework that was grounded in the muted group theory. Muted group theory stems from the sociocultural tradition, and it examines how gender impacts language and thus affects our social world. So this theory was developed by Karis Kramaria, Edwin Ardener, and Shirley Ardener. This theory is really interested in social power arrangements and how they are embedded in our language. So it describes how anthropologists often categorize culture in terms of in masculine terms, which led to an inherent masculine bias. So we often in text see the word actor instead of actress, and that's a really simple example, but if you read into their research, you'll see much more to that. But this inherent male bias can lead to the silencing of women's voices because the language is so built around a masculine profile. So this study kind of takes that framework and applies it to women with postpartum depression. And what they're basically saying is that women with postpartum depression are not living in a world with a dominant model of motherhood, and they're not that dominant model. So the dominant model would be, your healthy mother who's not experiencing postpartum depression. So women with postpartum depression often feel silenced, and I think this is connected to that the stigma around the illness. So they are a muted group. That's the assumption she's operating under when she conducts her research. So she recruited members by reaching out to social support groups and getting their leaders to, ask if anyone wanted to participate. She ended up with a sample of 27 women. Out of those, 23 self-identified as having symptoms similar to that of PPD. And she interviewed them using a semi-structured narrative method. So she chose to take a qualitative approach to her research, and she read those transcripts and then coded them, looking for specific statements relevant to the phenomena of social support, and she kind of grouped them into overarching themes. So she, in these interviews, she found 3 types of social support: informational, emotional, and tangible. So she interviewed women who were parts of 3 types of social support groups. So the first was a true postpartum depression social support group, a local mothers group, and a working moms group. So she found that members of the local mothers group did have a positive effect. They experienced emotional and tangible support, but women who had PPD did feel silenced in that group. They did not feel comfortable disclosing. And the same goes for the working mothers group, who did experience a very pragmatic and tangible support, informational support as well. But again, they felt very muted. They didn't feel comfortable disclosing their symptoms. So obviously the postpartum depression support group, women didn't have to disclose. It was just a given by being part of that group. So they automatically felt like they had a safe space. So these very specific support groups, like the postpartum depression support group, help normalize their feelings. It teased postpartum depression away from the margins and brought the issue central, to women and mothers in general. My discussion questions for this topic are: 1, how do micro-level communication processes such as the actual dialogue help create community and normalize conditions like postpartum depression? And number 2, what ideologies drive the function of social support groups and their micro-level communities? Sorry for running a little bit over, but I appreciate you listening, and I hope you found this article helpful. Thanks.